Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the EPC Friday Update, our weekly look at the key developments on COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global role, and for EU politics in general. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week to share their analysis of the current state of EU-US relations and the prospects for the future, with a particular focus on the November presidential elections. I'm delighted to welcome our special guest, Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is Senior Fellow at the Centre on the United States and Europe at Brookings, and she's a member of the EPC's Strategic Council. Great to have you with us from Washington today, Constanze, and thank you so much for getting up at an unseasonably early hour to be with us. Also with us, David O'Sullivan, who is chair of the EPC's Governing Board, and of course, a former EU ambassador to the United States, among many other distinguished positions. Plus, as always, for the weekly update, Fabian Zuleeg, chief executive of the EPC, and Janis A, the director of studies. As I said, we're going to devote almost all of the next 60 minutes to the current state of the EU-US relationship, the impact of COVID-19 on relations over recent months, and the prospects for the future, whatever the outcome of the November elections. We will also later on touch on Brexit, because we saw the end of the latest round of negotiations 24 hours early yesterday. So I will ask Fabian to give us a little bit of a sum up on where we are with that. Housekeeping before we start. As always, this is a totally interactive session. I have some questions for our panel, and then I will come to all of you. Your microphones are muted. If you want to speak to ask a question, just press the raise your hand button and I will unmute you when the time comes and gives you the floor. Or you can write your question. Click on enter a question, write your question and enter it. Could I please repeat my weekly plea for short, to the point, concise questions so that I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is to. Okay, let us get underway. And Constanze, may I turn to you first? Let's first talk about where we are now and the impact of COVID-19 on the transatlantic relationship. What is your assessment? I mean, we've seen, whether it be in relation to the World Health Organization, whether it be in relation to travel bans, either way, this sense of, my country first. And most notably this year, with the announcement that the US has bought all the stock of a particular drug, remdesivir, which is now being used to treat COVID-19, all the stock for the next 3 months. The crisis is making things much worse, is it not? Is that your assessment?
Well, I think the jury is out. Well, let me first say thank you very much for having me on this podcast. It's very nice of you. And also thank you to EPC for making me a member of their Strategic Council. I'm honored. And so it's a pleasure to be with you all and to speak to people in Brussels, even if it's only virtually, at 8 a.m. in Washington, D.C. So to your question, I think the jury's out on whether the pandemic has made things worse or whether it sort of struck into the geopolitical landscape like a bolt of lightning, exposing weaknesses, flaws, pre-existing conditions, as they say here in America, that were already there. And I think what's so remarkable about it is that it has really struck us at all levels, the societal, the economic, the institutional, the international. And I think obviously it's going to exacerbate the weaknesses that are already there, but above all, it shows the lack of resilience in the arrangements that we, I think, had sort of taken for granted.
And your assessment of where we go between now and November, as you say, hard to tell.
How much time do you have?
Well, to emphasize, I'm not going to ask you at any point in the next hour to predict the outcome of the elections. That would be foolish and unfair. But in terms of the next few months, so as we go into those elections, would you expect the election campaign itself to make the situation even more difficult? Or are we maybe in a state where it couldn't get much worse?
Well, I think a lot of us living in Washington have spent the past 3.5 years thinking almost every morning, well, it can't get any worse now. And being disproven rather quickly. And of course, David Sullivan, as a former EU ambassador to the US, can't speak to this, but I can, and it's been quite dramatic. I remember thinking in early January, I think it was January 2nd, with the killing of Soleimani, the senior Iranian official, that this was probably already rock bottom, and how wrong I was. I mean, we're now looking at a multi-crisis in America, a pandemic that has claimed more than 125,000 lives. We are well upwards of 40 million people out of work. And we are seeing what I would call a constitutional crisis that has been set off by the police killing in expectation of impunity in front of a camera of a black man called George Floyd, but is now a nationwide debate about systematic racism and inequality. And on top of all that, you have a very, very unusual presidential campaign with a very, very unusual president who has been holding rallies, whose poll numbers are going down, but who seems to be determined to carry on as though nothing much was happening in the medical field. So I predict, frankly, I predict that the crisis is going to get a lot worse between now and November on all levels. And presumably, you know, there are all sorts of possibilities that we can't imagine yet.
Absolutely. David, Constanze was saying there at the beginning, hard to tell whether the crisis has made matters worse or exposed and underlined the divisions that were there already. What is your assessment of where we are now and what impact the election campaign might have, as well as Constanze was saying, that deepening crisis in America, just as Europe is tentatively emerging, at least from this phase of it?
Yeah, and I tend to agree with Constanze. I don't know that the COVID-19 as such has made transatlantic relations worse or better. I mean, they're in a pretty dire state, and it hasn't helped. I think what is striking for me is the impact it's having on the US, and therefore the knock-on consequences it will have for the relationship and for America's role in the world. I mean, I was one of those early on who said, if this pandemic hits America, I don't think America is currently well equipped to deal with it. I mean, by the way, none of us are, so there's no sense of sort of schadenfreude vis-a-vis, you know, the particular difficulties of the US, because I think many of us have not handled it well. But particularly in the United States, you have, for me, four factors. One is the, as we have in Europe, the federal versus the state split of responsibility, and there's more responsibility at the state level than at the federal for dealing with these kind of issues. There is the strong streak of individualism in US society, which is morphed into kind of culture wars, which is you can't tell people what to do, and people resent. I mean, being asked to wear a mask, some people consider is almost un-American. And you have the healthcare system with serious weaknesses, of many people uninsured, very reluctant to go near a doctor or a hospital under any circumstances. And then you have on top of that a leadership in Washington, which is the opposite of what you would need to bind people together and promote cohesion, but a president who delights in being disruptive and divisive and kind of provoking people. So right at the moment when you would have most needed some sort of soothing words of coming together, you had someone whose instinct goes in the opposite direction. And these four things for me have combined to create a really serious situation in the US. And I agree with Constanze. I think this could get a lot worse. And what that has done,
if it does do, what does that mean for the relationship with any other country, particularly the EU, if it gets that much worse as you fear?
Well, I think it means, firstly, greater introversion, and maybe we come back to that. But I think one of the things that is a feature of the US these days is greater introversion, and this is only going to make it more so. Including the travel bans and the visa restrictions. I mean, you can see all the sort of drawing the wagons in a circle is a key feature. And unfortunately, I think it has also damaged America's image in the world, because let's face it, most of us grew up thinking this was the country that could get everything right. And here is a situation where the most advanced, richest, technologically superior military capabilities has actually probably managed it less well than, you know, some kind of developing countries. So this is a blow to America's prestige, which is, I mean, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what Constanze said, the people who are dying and the public health drama that is there. But still, there is a further erosion, I think, of America's kind of moral authority to lead the global community. And that's already been happening for other reasons, which we could come back to. But for me, that's going to be the biggest difficulty.
Absolutely. Fabian, your reaction to what you've heard in terms of the current state of play, and then we'll move on to talk about what the elections might mean for the relationship.
I think what is interesting that it shows some things which also have resonance in Europe. I think one of the things which I think is very important is that it shows that populists don't seem to cope very well with this kind of crisis, and that there's something within the nature of how they interact with their populations which leads them to not make the hard choices which need to be made in that kind of crisis. And we're seeing that across the world, not just in America. I think a second point I would make is it, for me, highlights very well a global paradox which we are in. And the global paradox is that this kind of crisis can only really be resolved by global cooperation. There are many issues here which are by their nature cross-border, and they will not be resolved within one country. But at the same time, this kind of crisis creates a situation where many countries are reverting back to my country first, my population first. The job of a government is to protect their citizens. So how do you bring those two together? And I think here we do actually have an advantage within the European Union, that we have a mechanism, despite all of the mistakes which have been made, all of the lack in speedy response. I think we are still in a place where we can get some of that cooperation going. But for the US, that seems to be much more difficult. And it will be interesting to see whether the elections will change something fundamentally.
Come back to that in a moment. And as you're saying there, so global cooperation absolutely crucial. And David highlighting there the risk of even greater introversion. What does that mean for the EU? How should the EU respond? We'll come back to it. But Janis, your first assessment and your reaction to what you've heard.
Yes, three quick points. The first one goes back to something which Constanze said in the beginning when you asked her about what she thinks in terms of the developments in the US and how they might be affecting transatlantic relations, and she answered, the jury is still out. And I think the same goes if you look onto the European side. We do not know where the situation with respect to the COVID-19 crisis and its multiple dimension will develop over the upcoming months or the upcoming year. So to make a speculation of how transatlantic relations will develop, if you look into the European equation, we also need to provide the same answer that Constanze gave, which is the jury is still out. The second point is, I think, if you now look at the current state and how Europeans are looking towards the US and are thinking, how will the transatlantic relationship develop? Obviously, they're following closely what's happening in the US, but I think you can, in general, see that there's a wait-and-see approach. People are in this mood of, let's wait what will happen until November and what happens afterwards. And they're careful not to commit any mistakes. Governments, representatives, high representatives of the EU institutions, not to make any mistakes in this in-between period. And the third point, and that's the bigger picture point, I think what we're seeing because of the COVID-19 crisis is that the crisis in many ways is an accelerator. And it is also an accelerator of trends at the global level, at the international level. And one trend which we witnessed over the past months, the past years, is the increasing polarization between the US and China. And that means, from a European perspective, that the danger is increasing, the perspective is increasing, the challenge is increasing, that Europeans might find themselves in a situation where they get squeezed, in between the US and China. And I think this is something where the crisis is functioning as an accelerator, and Europeans and US, by the way, will have to find a solution or have to find a response to that.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to the outlook, and as I say, without attempting to predict the result, Donald Tusk, Constanze, Donald Tusk, the former European Council president, tweeted yesterday, and I quote, "I got to know Donald Trump really well. These are the reasons why I pray for Joe Biden's success." I wanted to start first with an assessment of what happens if the result is Trump 2. There are people who say it's been pretty bad during Trump 1, but you ain't seen nothing yet, that this would really be the defining moment for the transatlantic relationship, and the damage might be irreparable in a way they don't feel it is now. Would you agree with that assessment? Do you think Trump 2 would be very different from Trump 1? And would the areas of tension be the same or different? We'll come back to Joe Biden later on, but your assessment of a Trump 2 and what it means.
Well, I think Trump 2 very simply would be Trump 1 on steroids. And if you thought Trump 1 was on steroids, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's already clear that he's trying to return to his trade war model. In other words, the weaponization of the interdependence between particularly America and Europe. I think we will see much more of that. I find it hard to imagine that he wouldn't try to decisively bring back American troops from the Middle East and from South Asia, and indeed to some degree from Europe. This is something that the Pentagon and the Congress are now currently trying to prevent him from doing. And I think you would see a continued decay in the institutions that make American foreign and security policy. Already you've seen a hollowing out of the State Department, of the Defense Department, of the National Security Council and the intelligence agencies. And you will see more of that. Much of that has been intentional, and it has been supplemented by people seeing the signs on the wall and running away and looking for careers in the private sector or academia. My colleagues at Brookings who have had careers in government, of whom there are many, are deeply, deeply worried about this. We had a conversation about this only yesterday. And you could also see, I think, a continued disintegration between the federal government and the states. You're already seeing states banding together to form coalitions, not just on managing the pandemic, but also on managing things like climate change or trade. And I think you would see more of that as well. I'm not predicting a disintegration of the union, but I think you would see a much looser and sort of much more conflictual arrangement between the federal government and the states. And you would, I think, see an even more polarized American society. Now, like Janis, I want to emphasize here that I meant it when I said the jury is still out, because we've seen we've seen in the past few weeks an extraordinary resurgence of American civic sentiment. In that week that began with Trump marching to the church and the brutal breakup of demonstrators before the curfew in front of the White House, and the news that there were paramilitary police units in Washington streets and the 82nd Airborne was on standby. And as we now know, some of these units had been issued bayonets. That, I think, brought a tipping point in American public opinion. And by the end of the week, the entire country, it seemed, was demonstrating on the streets, not just against the callous murder of George Floyd and others by police in expectation of impunity, but against the general state of affairs. And you saw I think you saw some of that as well at the Tulsa rally, where the campaign expected hundreds of thousands to show up, and in the end it was less than 6,000. That, I think, is a potent counterforce. And the great question of the coming 4 months is, can this counterforce translate into political organization and institutional reform?
Okay, and indeed, if that counterforce can begin to do that, what impact does that have, not just on the election result, but on what approach a Biden 1 administration might take? But we'll come back to that in a moment. Trump 1 on steroids, David. Is that how you view the prospect of Trump too? And if it is, what does it mean for the EU?
No, I could subscribe 100% to everything that Constanze said. The one thing you can say about President Trump is he's relatively consistent. What you see is what you get. And, you know, people said when he was a candidate in the primary that he would track to the center when he got the nomination. He would track to the center when he got elected, and he never has. He has consistently pursued the same fundamental approach and policy themes, and I don't think that he will change at all in second term. Indeed, he will feel vindicated if he wins. One perhaps slight bémol to put into it is, of course, it depends what happens in the Congress. If he were to be re-elected president, but the Democrats retook the Senate, I mean, it's perhaps unlikely because given the way the Senate and the Electoral College kind of track each other, but it could happen. Then, of course, he would be very constrained by Congress if he wins a majority back in the Senate and is able to continue his policies. Of course, then he will have an even freer hand. So yes, I agree. And it will be bad news for Europe for all the reasons that Constanze has mentioned. He will pursue the same security agenda, the same trade agenda, the same confrontation with China in his way, and his fundamental dislike of the European Union as such, which is something we haven't mentioned, but which is a unique feature of this presidency that we've never actually seen before. So I think all of that will continue, and it would create undoubtedly a very real crisis in transatlantic relations. So I don't think it's not something I think we can view with it's not a prospect we can view with equanimity, still less enthusiasm or optimism.
Indeed not. Janis and Fabian, if you'll bear with me, I'd like to look at the other side of the coin with Constanze and David first and then get you to react. So I mentioned Donald Tusk's prayers for a Joe Biden success. If Joe Biden wins, that would be one of his prayers answered. But I think the EU, the impression you get talking to a lot of EU people, Constanze, is they think Joe Biden is the answer to all their prayers. And that's all we need to put things back on an even keel, that the EU-US relationship would go back to where it was. Do you believe that is the case? Or do you believe that there might be a change of tone? David just mentioning there Donald Trump's visceral dislike of the EU. He thinks he's even said it was created as a plot to do down America. Are they right to think magically all our problems are solved?
Jackie, no. I think that it's true that Joe Biden himself, and perhaps some of his most senior advisors, those who served Clinton and Obama before them, are committed transatlanticists, know the worth of Europe and the European Union as allies of America and as factors in global geopolitics in their own right. But I think they will be significantly constrained by a number of factors. For one, the world has changed. And while I think that Biden might, as my colleague Tom Wright, whom David knows well, has written, while Biden might want to govern as a restorationist, he will find that he will have to act as a reformer. And so Democrats are divided between restorationists and reformers. There are restorationists who think, let's just turn back the clock and everything will be fine and dandy. And there is a significant other faction that says, look, the world has changed. We need to deal with an increasingly aggressive China. We need to deal with a Russia that has reinserted itself again as a significant player, not just in the Middle East and South Asia, but even in Latin America, in America's backyard, as it were. We need to deal with kleptocrats. We need to deal with authoritarians and illiberals, including in our own backyards and within the European Union. We need to be able to deal with illicit funding streams and so on and so on. In other words, there are many divisions between the restorationists and the reformers, or the centrists and the progressive in the Democratic Party. It is also not clear yet what price the sort of hardline progressives like Bernie Sanders and their tribe will exact for their support of Biden in the campaign and the Biden presidency. There are enormous divisions both on domestic and on foreign policy between these groups. And finally, let's not forget that during the Obama presidency, we saw a Republican Party and its cohorts determined to undermine the presidency of Obama. and being quite successful, not least because Obama had not, unlike Hillary Clinton, spent his Senate years learning how to beat opposing factions into a consensus. And so I worry that a Biden presidency would meet entrenched opposition within the Democratic camp from the Republicans, and would be forced by the multi-crisis that we described earlier of health, economics, institutions, and foreign policy, to spend a great deal of its attention on repairing internal affairs and have much less bandwidth than they might think now for foreign and security policy, all of which would leave the Europeans exposed in some very uncomfortable ways.
David, would you share that analysis? And as a diplomat with many, many years of experience, doesn't tone, I mean, tone does matter, doesn't it? If the language changes, if that visceral dislike of the EU goes, even if, as Constanze says, on substantive issues, there may not be as much change for all the reasons she enumerated, it would be important that the way the US talks about Europe, the way the debate is framed, how much difference would that alone make, do you think?
I'll come back to that if I may, Jackie. I just wanted to make one other comment linked to what I said earlier. A lot depends on how this election is won, by whomever. And that's going to be important. Is it a very decisive victory, a clear victory of both the presidential candidate and in both houses of Congress? If you have a situation where President Trump gets reelected via the Electoral College, but losing the popular vote very substantially, and there are some statistical analyses out there which show that he could lose the popular vote by as much as 6 million votes. That's twice the number of Mrs. Clinton's lead, and still win the Electoral College. So then you are going to be into a real, in my view, constitutional crisis perhaps in the US. So that's just something we shouldn't lose sight of. It's not just about who wins the presidential, it's about what happens, how they win it, and what happens elsewhere in the political system. For Biden, yes, tone will make a big difference. It will be nice to have a president who goes back to the more practiced discourse of American presidential candidates and winners. But I think that the most important thing for us is we have to, as Europeans, understand the structural changes. Trump is a symptom, not the cause of many of the policies that he now espouses. And some of them were already there under Obama. And I think the three areas I think we need to look at are security, defense, burden sharing, the issue of trade, and the issue of China. And on all those three issues, I would expect that, for the reasons Constanze just mentioned, a certain degree of continuity in the policies. And we're going to have to deal with that. And it is arguably going to be actually rather more difficult if you have a president who approaches you in a nice way and sort of says, hey, I want you on board, but I want you on board with my policies, which are actually not that different from some of the policies or some of the substance that was being discussed before. And then it becomes very challenging. What is our strategic relationship with the United States? How far are we prepared to compromise on burden sharing, on opening our markets in the areas where they say we're being unfair, rightly or wrongly? How much of an alliance do we want with the United States on China? These will be tough questions for us. And if Biden does win, this may be the last chance to reinvent the transatlantic relationship for the 21st century, given also the demographic changes which are taking place in the United States, where Europe is much less at the center of people's preoccupations generally.
Thank you. And just before I come to Janis and Fabian, I do promise I will, John Kerr asks, what about Edward Luce's all too plausible nightmare scenario? Trump loses, but refuses to go. And I just wanted to pick that up here, David, because of your point about it's the manner of the victory that matters too. Is there, do you believe, either of you, a scenario in which he does lose, but he refuses to accept the result? Constanze, what's your sense of that?
I've read Luce's piece. I mean, I don't think that's an unreasonable speculation, but it is speculation. And I think that at some point the Republican Party is going to have to decide to cut its losses. You know, in other words, for Trump, this is about his political survival and that of his clan. for the Republican Party, larger things are involved. And I would imagine that the Republican Party might play a role if Trump refused to go.
Thank you. Janis, your reaction to what David and Constanze have been saying about what Trump 2 would mean and what a Biden 1 would mean. And if I can summarize it incredibly oversimplistically, not as much difference in the case of a Biden 1 as we might hope or think on substantive issues, and David listed them there. We could see very little change, even if the tone changes. Would you agree with that? And let's start to begin to consider what that means for the European Union, if indeed we're in a scenario where either things are going to get much worse or they're not going to get much better.
Let me share one thought each, one on the scenario of Trump 2 and one on Biden 1. With respect to Trump 2, taking into account what Constanze said, Trump 1 on steroids, what David said with respect, you get what you see. If you take both of that into account and you look into transatlantic relations, you look over the past 4 years, you try to look forward to the next 4 years with Trump 2, the likelihood might be high, and there are a good number of people who argue in that direction, that he will try to divide us even more than he tried to divide us Europeans over the past years. And the question is how we will react to that attempt, to these attempts to divide us. And he might have less scruple when doing so, by the way. Will we then react as I think we have done by far, I think mostly over the past years, which is that we have united, that we have fear that if we are divided as EU 27, that at the end of the day will cost us individually in economic terms and political terms, maybe even in security terms. So we have come to the conclusion that being united is probably the better option rather than having us divided. But will that be the same also over the next 4 years if the attempts from the White House, from Trump 2, are stronger to divide us? I'm not sure. I'm asking the question. With respect to Biden 1, I think nobody believes, and nobody in Europe believes, that there is a way to any kind of a status quo ante. So it's not about turning back time, going back to the period we were before Trump came into office. And by the way, even during the Obama period, things were not as smoothly as some might be thinking in retrospect. So there were already problems. There were already some potential frictions or increasing frictions between both sides of the Atlantic already starting during the Obama period. But what happens if Biden comes to power and you have what some are called the "we are back" hypothesis, that on issues related, for example, to Paris, to climate change, we are ready to play ball again from the US side. On issues related to Iran, we're ready to at least go back to the table, discuss things. On multilateralism, we're in general going to have a more constructive approach, as you Europeans have asked us to have. I think if that would happen, now I'm simplifying, I know, I think one question which might come up is, so what about China in this case? How do you Europeans position yourselves vis-a-vis the increasing polarization which we're having between the US and China? And how do you Europeans will position yourselves on this major geopolitical question, with which, again, the verdict is then also very much still out?
And your point there about dividing member states, there is a question from the audience, asked two questions in relation to member states. The German EU presidency, does it make a difference at this time? And what about the moving of troops out of Germany and possibly to Poland? Is this a mark, and how does the EU respond to this sort of divisiveness? We'll come back on that in a minute. But Fabian, your assessment of a Trump 2 or a Biden 1, are you broadly in line with what everybody else is saying here?
Yes, I'm broadly in line. I want to also be uncharacteristically optimistic, just for a change, but then there will be a sting in the tail. Uncharacteristically optimistic in the sense that yes, of course, it is far too early to tell. But I have the feeling now that because of the disappointment the last time round, where most people did not expect that Trump would actually be elected, there's now insufficient preparation for the possibility of Biden being elected, and that we're not actually preparing for the better case scenario. And whatever we might think about the detailed policy. I mean, just having someone there who is not actively trying to destroy the European Union is going to make a big difference moving forward. I think what will be the case in either situation, different in tone, different in the way it is being done, but the underlying theme, which has always been there over the last years, also with Obama and even before that, is that Europe needs to take more responsibility. That there are many areas where Europe has hidden under the shield of the US, and that is just no longer feasible. And that is not going to be feasible whether we have Biden or Trump in the White House. But I wanted to add the final, more negative comment, the pessimistic comment. And that is to do with the economics. And I think we are underestimating the impact this crisis is going to have on economic rivalry, because what we are talking about is a global demand crisis where we have massive excess capacity in a number of different sectors. And that excess capacity will have to be resolved somehow across borders. So the tendencies for countries to think my country first, my industry first, will be accentuated much more. So whoever is in power in the White House, the questions of, for example, how do we deal with the rivalry between Airbus and Boeing at a time when global demand for new aircraft is going to reduce quite drastically? How are we going to cope with those kind of demand shifts? And I think what the tendency will be is that every country will go down the route of my interest comes first. I will try to use the mechanisms which are there globally, and that also includes various forms of extortion, if you like, pushing countries to do whatever you want them to do. And I think that is the world we're going to be in, regardless of what happens in terms of the election.
And an interesting point indeed from a European perspective, because the EPC yesterday published a new paper on fostering Europe's strategic autonomy, a new agenda for trade and investment. So this emphasis in Europe as well on autonomy, on sovereignty and so on. But Constanze, could you just pick up on this point? I'm quite fascinated by the relationship between Angela Merkel and Donald Trump. But there's a question now about, does the German EU presidency make a difference at this crucial time? And on this question of divide and rule, if you like, so moving troops from one member state to another, how Germany is likely to react to that. What's your reading of that? And then we'll come back to these issues of economic rivalry, trade tensions, China, and multilateralism. Lots to discuss, not much time to do it, but just on the German presidency and Angela Merkel.
All right, and the troops. I just want to say I agree with Fabian that I think we haven't seen the end of this economic crisis yet, and it will be the defining, I think that will be the defining crisis of, you know, the coming years. It's and I agree that we will all be dealing with nationalist impulses. That will be difficult for the European Union in particular. In fact, Janis, I think, you know, we're perfectly good at creating our own internal divisions, and Germany has not been the best bridge builder always. So we shouldn't put all of this down to the United States. It's we have our own responsibility there. That brings me to the German presidency. The German presidency, I think, has already, as it were, upped the ante by this historic shift in German thinking on mutualizing the debt, at least for the crisis. This is not a Hamiltonian moment in the sense that Germany is acquiescing to giving the EU taxation powers or to creating sort of European bonds in perpetuity, but it is a huge shift and a huge commitment. Still, we have significant divisions between East and West and North and South of Europe that Europe needs to bridge in negotiating even this new recovery fund and the next European budget. And that would be enough to occupy any presidency without the pandemic and its consequences and without the truly dire geopolitical circumstances that Europe finds itself in. I think that we're lucky to have a German chancellor who clearly is determined to make a mark, but she's going to have her work cut out for her. And I don't see the Europeans just lining up to say yes. In fact, I see in many cases the opposite. We haven't even mentioned, or we've mentioned obliquely, the fact that we have with Hungary and Poland 2 countries that are developing in an extremely problematic direction. And there too is a question that needs to be resolved. Now, as for the troop reduction threat, it's clear, as I said earlier, that the Senate and Congress are determined, and together with the Department of Defense here, to slow roll this effort to take nearly 10,000 troops out of Germany. The administration's rationale appears to be a mixture of vindictive, punitive. It's the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, had an op-ed about 10 days ago in the Wall Street Journal where he suggested, oh yes, we have a strategic rationale. These troops need to be moved to the Indo-Pacific. They need to be moved to other parts of Poland. Big bases are obsolete. And then he added, but Germany has a chance to redeem itself by getting rid of the Nord Stream 2 project, throwing Huawei out of the 5G network, and spending more on defense. So you have to ask yourself, which is it? Is it strategic or is it vindictive? It's not entirely clear. And I think that the German government here has responded with admirable restraint. But the truth of the matter is, of course, that the Trump administration has a point, that we aren't doing enough for our own defense as Germans and as Europeans. Where it's sort of completely missing the point is an understanding that in a geopolitical environment where hard power is far less relevant, at least on some accounts, than economic power, the EU is, and its single market, is a truly significant power asset as an ally for the United States, and that it would be better for America to work with the European Union to deal with the surge of China than to try and disassemble the European Union while trying to thwack China and embrace Russia.
And let me, David, if I might pick up on that point about China and also link it to what Janis said earlier when he talked about the risk of the EU being squeezed in the middle of escalating tensions between the US and China. Again, how different might things be if we have a Biden 1 instead of a Trump 2? And what can the EU do to avoid or to mitigate that risk of a squeeze? Do you share that analysis of the risk, and what should the EU do in those circumstances?
No, I share the analysis. I mean, I think we're already in that situation, and it is not a comfortable situation, because on the substance, there is really no choice between China and the United States in terms of our values, in terms of our global interests. On the other hand, nobody believes that a sterile Cold War confrontation with China is the way to go, at least not in Europe. And the idea of decoupling from China, I was on a conversation recently where people were actually saying, well, in fact, it's the other way around. China risks to decouple from us first. Because they can become increasingly autonomous. So actually, our real strategic interest is to avoid a decoupling, where China would not have the same stake in the international system that they currently do. I think that the challenge is going to be, as I said earlier, that if you have an American president who is much more congenial and much more moderate and goes back to an older style, but who still says, I want you on my side in this push with China. The question is going to be, do we as Europeans have a strategy to suggest to that president that is not a strategy of pure confrontation? And are we capable of selling that? The difficulty of working with the American friends, as we all know, is their definition of coordination is, here is my position, wouldn't you like to sign up to it? It's not, you know, what do you think and how can we adjust it? It's you know, sign on. And the trick will be, can we actually have a real discussion where we sit down and say, what is really in our best interests to tackle this China issue, which is real, which is challenging, but which also requires us to be nimble and clever. What are we going to do about others in the international scene? Countries in Asia, Japan, ASEAN. What are we going to do about India? Other people who have concerns, but different interests. And building a real alliance to address some of these difficult issues, while at the same time not alienating and not provoking China. It's not going to be easy because China is not its own best friend. Look at what's happening in Hong Kong. They are clearly making life much more difficult for those who say, let's have a good relationship. So that's going to be the difficulty. And for me, the important thing is that we as Europeans should be thinking much more than we are at the present time about what is our strategic offer to the United States for a new transatlantic relationship, looking at these issues of security, of trade, of China, and what does that look like? What are we prepared to give, and what is our ask? And how do we get that balance? Because I think this is the key question for us, because it's a fundamental relationship. There's no more important relationship for us than the transatlantic, but it is eroding and it is fraying at the edges. And if we want to reset it, we have to come, it seems to me, to the new administration with some concrete ideas about, on the one hand, what we're prepared to do to meet some of their concerns, and on the other hand, how they could benefit from aligning more closely with us and not trying to go it alone.
Okay, I see both Janis and Fabian want to come in. Fabian first, then Janis.
I think, first of all, yes, we need to, sorry.
All right.
No, here you go, Fabian, come on.
A very brief comment. I mean, I think I agree with everything which has been said. I think one question we can ask ourselves is, what if a new administration comes and offers things to Europe? How would we actually respond? What if, for example, the transatlantic trade partnership in whatever form comes back onto the agenda? Are we in Europe ready for that kind of offer? Because I have very severe doubts that, given all the skepticism which is there around globalization, around trade, also around the relationship with the United States, would make it very easy to agree to something like that. Because also, even if it is a Biden administration, clearly there are vested interests which would have to be represented in that. So how do we deal with American agriculture within that context? How do we deal with the question of Paris? If the US administration signs up, fine, we're back to something more normal. But if not, are we going to reject economic cooperation on that basis? So there are actually many unanswered questions within the European Union, and that, I think, comes back to my point about we're not really preparing for that scenario. We're not thinking about what is our strategic response to whatever happens across the Atlantic. But in some ways, we're hoping that Trump will be replaced, but then we don't know what to do next.
Janis, and then I think, Constanze, you wanted to come back in.
I think that both David and Fabian are right when they're indicating to us that there are things which we need to prepare ourselves for in order to be able to, when the moment comes, that we can react in a certain way and have coordinated among ourselves, whether it's in the realm of the economy or in the security or wherever it is, trade. But I want to make a step back, which is that if you want to look into the future of transatlantic relations, if you want to look into the future relationship with China, I think at the end of the day, a lot will determine on us. So when Constanze was earlier saying that we have done also our share as Europeans not to be on the same page, we have been dividing ourselves, she's right, obviously. And I think this is going to be the same picture in future in terms of the development we will have within the EU will determine our ability to constructively and proactively deal with a future relationship with Washington, whoever is DC, whoever is in the White House, and whatever direction the Chinese will take. And now I'm also going to put on my positive hat, as Fabian tried to do at least earlier on. In the current situation of the crisis, if you compare how the EU, Europeans have dealt with the crisis, we have not been perfect. Within these Friday updates, we often be very critical of what has happened over the past months. But if you see of how Europeans have reacted to it in terms of the numbers and the health crisis, yes, there were severe blows in individual member states, but we've gotten things under control. Some countries have dealt with it very positively. We, I think, are going to have an agreement on the MFF, on the recovery plan. We might have it earlier than we think. The ECB has acted very quickly compared to what it did in 2010, 2012. So what could very well be that if we look into 2021, that Europeans might not be in that bad of a situation in terms of how they have reacted to the COVID-19 crisis. And I think that will, to a big extent, determine of how the transatlantic relations will develop in future, and also our relationship with China and in the triangle.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because Constanze, I think you wanted to come back in on this. I want to come back on the trade question, and I have a question to take from the floor, but Constanze first.
Well, just briefly, I think Europeans would be well advised now to reach out to the Biden camp, which is still quite unformed and, as I said, very diverse, to try and understand its thinking and, if possible, to shape it. I sent you all an essay that I've just had in the German magazine Internationale Politik that makes that point. It seems to me that Republican thinking on Europe is far more precise than what you can find in the Democratic camp. In the Republican articulation of post-Trumpism, if you will, so post-Trump America First policies, is one in which allies are told to put up and fall in line. And to quote one of the seminal essays on the topic, with real pressure if need be. I think that line perhaps underestimates the degree to which America needs its allies, and to which those allies, in particular the EU, have leverage and counterforce that they can oppose to attempts to coerce them. But the truth is also, unfortunately, that we need America. And I think the moment is now to reach out to Democrats and to say, this is how we see what is happening. This is what we need. This is what we think you need, and we're here to help. And I hope that people are doing that, but I am not seeing it.
Thank you. John Palmer, you have a question. You have the floor. John, are you there? No?
Yes, can you?
Hang on, try once. Yeah, hang on, you keep muting yourself again. Hang on, I'll try once more.
Sorry. Hi, David, and everybody else. Nice to see you. My question is simple. If we get a Trump 2 even more assertive and unilateral, can NATO, as we know it, survive? And what would that mean? But secondly, more optimistically, if we get a Biden presidency, could the European Green Recovery New Deal morph into something much broader and more global, on which some Americans and Europeans could work on together?
You said it was a simple question. Two huge questions there. Who can come in and respond on that one?
Let me take the NATO point. I do think that we have to take the point made in John Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happened, very seriously. That Trump was absolutely dead serious about taking America out of NATO, and that the country got far closer to this than people at the time realized. And I think that in a second Trump administration, I think it's absolutely clear to me that the president would try again. And, you know, even if he didn't, the degree of turmoil that we're already seeing within the alliance, and that is going to continue and be exacerbated, is enough to undermine alliance cohesion per se. The extraordinary amount of schmoozing, for lack of a better word, between the president, Vladimir Putin, does that not undermine the sense of America's commitment to the alliance? Of course it does. That's it.
Thank you very much. I think you signaled you wanted to come in briefly, if you would, because I'd also like to come back on the Green Deal, but also on the economic rivalry you talked about. But I think you wanted to react to John's question. No?
I wanted to react on the Green Deal, just to say that I think that of course there are also strong interests in the US who have quite a competitive advantage in some areas of green technology. So I would certainly think there's an interest there to see what can actually be done at the global level. But I think we need to be careful also that there's a little bit of European arrogance, that sometimes we think that because we have a president in the White House who is climate skeptic and who is in some ways anti-Green Deal, that this is reflected in society. I mean, in many ways, America is more advanced on some of these issues than the European Union. So I think this is about interests, and I would certainly think there are common interests, but it wouldn't be in one direction when it comes to the competition between European and American firms.
Okay, Janis, a very short one, if you would.
Just a short one. I think that with respect to the Green Deal and as to whether there's a chance that at global level, together with the US, things might be changing, I think let's first of all look at the EU27 themselves and to what degree they will be actually ready to implement, to do what they have said in so many nice Sunday speeches with respect to greening the economy, making it more sustainable. I think as the economic crisis deteriorates because of the COVID-19 situation, we will see that this will become increasingly difficult. That doesn't mean it's the end of the Green Deal, but it becomes increasingly difficult. And it's not only problems between member states, it's issues within individual countries where strong interest holders are not wanting to go in that direction either. So let's see how far the U27 will get on that end.
Two more questions before we close. One, which I'm going to ask Constanze about Russia in a moment. But David, can I just pick up on Fabian and what he was saying earlier about economic rivalry? And we were talking about Europe's greater emphasis on autonomy and sovereignty and so on. Inevitably, it looks as if on both sides of the Atlantic, there will be a more protectionist approach as people struggle to recover from the crisis. As someone with such lengthy experience, a former Director General for Trade, of lengthy experience of trade negotiations, briefly, what would you advise? I know, pretty impossible to answer briefly, but in terms of the EU to prepare and to try to mitigate the risk, particularly if we have a Trump 2, of much worse trade wars, what can the EU do to prepare? Is there anything you can do at this stage?
Well, I think the first point I would make is I'm actually fairly skeptical that there is going to be a significant protectionist trend in Europe. This word strategic autonomy, open strategic autonomy, much debated. I don't think that the center of gravity in the current European Union is for protectionism. There will be some reassessment of diversification of supply lines, of looking at some essential supplies and how you would secure them in the future. But fundamentally, if you look at the European Union and its policies until now, it has been one of trade opening and trade liberalization. And I don't think that is going to fundamentally change, because to be honest, the alternative is economic impoverishment, not economic growth. Now, how we deal with the United States, I think the fundamental question to me is how we get back to reinstating a sense of mutual interest in the degree of economic interpenetration we have. The transatlantic economic corridor is the most important economic corridor in the world. You know all the statistics, but they're real. And the question is, if the Americans feel that somehow this is not working perfectly to their interest, let's sit down and figure out how we deal with that and what we are prepared to do to accommodate that and what we can't do and how we change it. Because I think we need to get back to a situation where we have more complicity between the EU and the US on these issues. There will be competition, there will be rivalry, but I believe in the past we've managed that nonetheless with a certain common sense of understanding of the mutual benefit of a relatively open system. And I think that is what we need to get back to, and we need to also then be able to work eventually with the US on shoring up the WTO and making the global system function, because the alternative we know is a downward spiral of economic performance, not an improved standard of living for any of our citizens.
Absolutely. We are almost out of time, but Constanze, I want to come back to you. 2 questions from the audience. A lot of focus we've put on the EU-US-China triangle so far. Could you elaborate on squaring the triangle to include the big EU neighbor in the East, Russia? What role will EU-Russia relations play vis-a-vis the transatlantic partnership? How should the EU position itself? And do you expect a big difference between a Trump 2 or a Biden 1 on the question of Russia?
Right. Since we're at 9 on the hour, I'm going to have to be extremely short here. The Russians have just had a referendum to essentially enable Putin to rule the country, you know, almost for the rest of his life. I think that should shape the way we think about the relationship. We're already out of, you know, the era where we thought we were going to have a strategic partnership with Russia was over, and has been over for quite a while now. But I wonder, frankly, whether Russia and China will be having a good pandemic. In fact, I think they're already having a quite bad pandemic. And I think that will, in the mid to long term, render their leadership and their ruling elites more fragile. Now, because Russia is our neighbor, that has potential consequences for us in terms of our regional security. It is likely to make Russia more assertive and more unpredictable in the short term, and that will make it a very problematic partner at a time when we already have significant problems with Russia in the arms control arena. In other words, we Europeans need an America that is on our side in this business, and not on the side of the Russians as Trump is. That is a problem that we're going to have to address with Biden. And I think that Biden's impulse would be to be on the opposite of Trump's position. But the truth is that this is going to be a very, very hard conundrum for all of us.
Thank you very much. Something I'm sure we'll come back to. Before we close, I was going to ask you to all give a piece of advice to the EU, but you already have very eloquently given a lot of advice over the last hour. But Fabian, before we close, I just wanted to come back to the inevitable topic of Brexit. This, of course, the UK, it is linked to what we've been discussing, because the UK has been trying to put some pressure on the EU by, it says, putting pressure on by negotiating a trade deal with the US in tandem. We won't get into that. But we did also see this week Brexit negotiations, first face-to-face ones since March, finished a day early. You might think, well, that's great. They're going so well, they didn't need the whole week. Turns out from the mood music afterwards, that's not the case. What is briefly your reading now of where we are after this first round of face-to-face for a long time?
I'll be very brief, also not to inflict Brexit on everyone too long, but the situation hasn't essentially changed. There is no progress on the real sticking points in these negotiations, and whatever the mood music is behind it, you have to resolve these. The only way they can be resolved is if Boris Johnson U-turns on some of what he has portrayed as red lines for the UK. So the question really is, will he U-turn or will he not? And if he does, when will that be? And I think, frankly, it is too early for him to U-turn. That will only be decided really in autumn, when it is already too late. But just one final point on the EU-US relationship. I think the one thing a Biden victory would mean is that this illusion, which I think is also an illusion with Trump, but this illusion of a grand UK-US trade deal, which will solve all of the economic woes of the UK in the post-Brexit period, that illusion would be destroyed if you have a Biden victory. It would be much, much harder to argue it, but in substance, it actually changes very little, because the chances of having a meaningful trade deal with the Trump administration are also not given.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. On the topic of Brexit, I draw your attention to a discussion paper published today entitled Heading for Disaster by Roger Liddell, a Labour peer. I think you can guess from the title of that publication where he's coming from on Brexit. Also, I mentioned the paper on fostering Europe's strategic autonomy, a joint paper by the EPC and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, authored by Johan Bjerkum. There will be a commentary next week by Fabian on the need to go beyond a single market and establish a single economic territory, and a policy brief on governing internet platforms by Andreas Antoudiniakis. And just one event to draw your attention to. There's lots going on next week, but one event the week after, which I'd particularly like to highlight, on July the 13th, it links very much to what we've been talking about today. It's an EPC Konrad Adenauer Stiftung online policy dialogue on what can a German presidency do for a post-COVID-19 Europe. And I will see you back here next Friday, provisionally at our usual time of 11 o'clock. Where I'll be joined by Janis and other members of the EPC team for the Friday update. So in the meantime, will you join me virtually, if not in reality, in thanking our panel very much, and particularly Constanze for joining us from Washington. It was fascinating to get your insights and perspectives on what's happening there and what it means for us, and just how much the EU perhaps needs to wake up to some realities it hasn't. David, thank you so much to you, and to Janis and to Fabian, as always. Thank you for joining us. Have a good weekend and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you for not asking me to do this at 11 a.m. or 5 a.m. my time. Very kind of you.
Very kind of you to join us.
Bye. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Constanze. Thank you.